and we are the programming arm of SAPIR, which is a quarterly journal of ideas for a thriving Jewish future. It is our honor to partner with Park Avenue Synagogue for tonight's event, and we want to welcome the hundreds of you who have joined online and here in person for tonight's gathering. You've heard this story, I guarantee it. A Jewish man is shipwrecked on a desert island. Over time, he finds enough material for the important things, to build a house, a store, even a synagogue. After years of prayer, he's finally rescued by a passing ship. The sailors help him gather his belongings, and just before they depart, one of the sailors, he looks incredulous, and he says, "Hey, did you build 2 synagogues?" The man takes a deep sigh. He rolls his eyes and he says, this is my synagogue. And that," he says, pointing at the other, "that's the synagogue I would never set foot in." It's a classic story. Why? Because it speaks to the heart of the Jewish experience. As a people, we take great pride that ours is a history chock full of disagreements, of disputes, of differing points of view. Abraham literally debated with the divine. Kings and prophets quarreled endlessly. Rabbis fought over text, not just in person, but over generations and centuries. For nearly 3,000 years, wrote Mark Charendoff, publisher of SAPIR, this diversity has been a Jewish superpower, a force that has enriched our traditions and strengthened our collective identity. Yes, we were once strangers in a strange land, but we have never been strangers to a good argument. And while that's true, and a little bit corny, it's also the case that our history is filled with examples, from Korach in the Bible to Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya in the Talmud, of times when a particular point of view simply went too far, and when communal leaders decided to erect a boundary and guard against the potential fallout from a particular perspective. So how do we balance the respect our tradition bestows upon differing perspectives with the desire to protect the well-being of the community? Should there be limits around what constitutes acceptable discourse within Jewish communities? What are those boundaries? How are they set, and by whom? These questions have had particular resonance in the weeks and months after October 7th. And they're also the very questions that animated the founding of SAPIR more than 4 years ago. In fact, it was in early 2021 when the Maimonides Fund launched SAPIR because it saw value in platforming different voices on issues of concern to the future of the Jewish people. And so, if you are unafraid to read diverse, even contradictory voices from leading figures within and beyond the Jewish world, then I encourage you to visit sapirjournal.org and subscribe to the journal, which, by the way, you can receive for free. If it's perfectly in a talit bag, and if you're really bored at the Seder, you can fit it in your Haggadah. No one's gonna notice. Trust me, I did it last year. Don't tell my parents. Okay, and now to the program. To help us make sense of this moment and to begin to think about the bounds of Jewish disagreement, we have 3 extraordinary panelists and 1 state-of-the-art moderator. Adam Kirsch is a poet, a critic, editor at the Wall Street Journal's Weekend Review section. He's the author, most recently, of On Settler Colonialism, Ideology, Violence, and Justice. And he is also the author of the superb SAPIR essay, Are Zionists and Anti-Zionists Arguing for the Sake of Heaven? Please join me in welcoming Adam. Ariella Saperstein is the associate publisher of SAPIR, the director of Viewpoint Diversity Initiatives at Maimonides Fund. She is a dear friend, a trusted colleague, and a very wise voice. Please join me in welcoming Ariella. Bret Stephens is a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist who is best known as the fearless leader and editor-in-chief of SAPIR. He wrote an essay in the current issue of SAPIR entitled Viewpoint Diversity Up to a Point. I encourage you all to read it. He is new to panel discussion, so please be kind to him, everyone. Bret Stephens. And And moderating today's discussion is the Mora D'Atra of this renowned synagogue, a towering rabbi, teacher, author, and SAPIR contributor, Rabbi Ariella Cosgrove. The bima is yours.
Hanan, thank you. Thank you to all of the colleagues from SAPIR who are here this evening. Friends, it's a personal friendship. It's an institutional friendship. I was worried, Hanan, with where you were going with that joke you opened with, that you were going to say, and this is a synagogue I would never walk into. But you didn't, and I'm glad you didn't. It's great to have the SAPIR community here. I feel like we're getting ready for the Passover Seder, which begs the question, who's the wise, who's the wicked, who's the simple, and who's the one who just doesn't know what to ask? But let's see where that goes. And it's wonderful to welcome friends and colleagues and thought leaders to the pulpit of Park Avenue Synagogue. This is the kickoff of the diversity issue, the issue on viewpoint diversity of SAPIR, the latest issue, the latest conversation through the good works of SAPIR. And I want to begin with the opening line. Ariella, I'm going to direct this question to you as the associate publisher of SAPIR. Mark Cherendorf begins his publisher's note by saying, Judaism has long celebrated the value of diversity rooted in its traditions of argument, debate, and the respectful exchange of ideas, which is to say that the one thing that Jews can agree on is our willingness to disagree. So it doesn't seem new. We disagree. We have viewpoint diversity. So why this issue physically, and why this issue right now in the Jewish communal conversation?
Sure. So first, thank you for having me in this conversation. I'm honored to join Adam and Bret. When we started SAPIR, some of you may know this, we positioned the journal as an exploration of sort of the intersection between issues of concern to the Jewish community and larger American cultural and political conversations. And one of our goals is to provide people with new ways of thinking about these issues, perhaps perspectives that they are less inclined to encounter solely within the Jewish community, and to challenge what we sometimes see as sort of one-sided discourse on particular issues. Now, we decided on the diversity theme before the Trump administration started their focus on DEI and diversity, but it did prove to be especially timely, I think, given that we came out just after this conversation has been very much in the news. And our initial conversation was that the diversity conversation within the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community is often less diverse than it should be. I think we've assumed that particular things lead to diverse conversations. We've often talked about diversity in terms of race and gender and sometimes religion, and we assume that if we bring people together sort of based on those criteria, that it will lead to a complex, interesting, diversity of perspectives, which is sometimes the case, but certainly not always the case. And we have felt that the diversity conversation was flattened in many ways inside of the Jewish community. And you may be right that it feels like Jews embrace viewpoint diversity and diverse perspectives, and I think most people in here would probably raise their hands and say that they do, but we'll probably get to this in the conversation. Once it becomes real, I think some of us are actually not so sure that we're so gung-ho about viewpoint diversity. When October 7th happened, we had a conversation internally also, is this something that we want to double down on? So, and back in 2022, I should say also, my colleague Felicia Herman published this piece in SAPIR called We're All Just Waiting to Get Fired. And that was based on interviews with professionals, mostly senior leaders within the Jewish community, expressing at that time that there were topics that they felt they could not candidly express opinions about within the workplace. And I think that's progressed since then. We've seen that obviously in the larger culture, not just in the Jewish community, but it was becoming such a live issue in the Jewish community that we felt it warranted an issue on this theme. And just the last thing I'll say is, we don't intend this to just be a critique of the way that diversity work has been done either. Our purpose is to envision new ways of talking about diversity, give people new tools and language and ways to imagine how we conceptualize diversity inside and outside the Jewish community.
All right, well, thank you, and thank you for this issue. I haven't read every single article in it, but it's certainly a necessary and urgent conversation on the Jewish docket. Bret, I want to begin with your piece in it, which, as always, is beautifully and provocatively written, and you openly struggle. I think that's what I found about that. You presented a personal struggle in that essay about viewpoint diversity up to a point. And you're someone who's very much made debate and dialogue, the Chicago principles, engaging with uncomfortable truths of the other, as sort of the hallmark of your career. If I'm not mistaken, you left the Wall Street Journal. One of the many reasons was you wanted a voice to exist in the ecosystem of a more liberally minded newspaper. So this is when people think of Bret Stephens, people think of viewpoint diversity, and then you say, but there are limits. I'm wondering if you could tell me what's changed in your mind, why are there limits, and what this reflects on the evolution of your thinking.
No, you're right that I wrote an essay that rare for me doesn't come to a firm conclusion on a topic of public discussion. And it is true that for many years in commencement speeches, in columns in the New York Times and elsewhere, I've really tried to make the case that in an era of cancellations and growing censoriousness, it's incredibly important to open up to the possibility through critical engagement with different points of view that we might change our minds, that there's a great value in opening the door to a very wide variety of opinions, that just as you want your opinion to be included in a given debate, you have to also make allowances for the opinions of those with whom you may strenuously disagree. And for years, I tried to put this in practice in not just in terms of a kind of an intellectual advocacy, but my willingness to engage meaningfully with people with whom I had very profound differences of opinion. One person in particular, this is the kind of genesis of this essay, was, as I describe him, someone who had been a center-left Zionist who had moved more and more left until he had become probably the most prominent Jewish anti-Zionist in the United States. And for years, he and I would get on stage together, like Twiddly D and Dumb. I was D. And we would merrily debate and vigorously debate. And I really took issue with his point of view, but backstage we were friendly with one another. Then October 7th happened, and his views simply departed so far from mine in terms of where he thought the weight of responsibility lay, in terms of his belief that there shouldn't be a Jewish state, that something in me snapped. And a few months ago, I was approached, because this person has a book coming out, or maybe just had his book come out, and I was approached to join him on stage in public debates, at least two of them. There was a small fortune actually involved in the speaking fee, so it's rare for me to turn down small fortunes. And I said to myself, I will never appear on stage with him again, ever, under any circumstances. And I wrestled with that for the reasons that I have been an advocate of viewpoint diversity and the contest of ideas for a long time. So that is what my essay is about. And just very briefly, what the lodestar of this essay, it's titled Viewpoint Diversity Up to a Point, was a brief passage in George Will's book from the 1980s, Statecraft as Soulcraft, which I read when I was in high school. Being the young conservative that I was, I read George Will's book.
I read his book on baseball in high school.
You were a cooler kid than I. It's a wonderful book, actually. It's a really profound first-rate book, but there's a passage in it in which he says the four most important words in the political lexicon are up to a point. We want environmental protection. Up to a point. We want a strong military. Up to a point. We want a safe and secure streets, up to a point. And you think of any given topic, and you realize that there is a limit to the good, right? If we just only wanted environmental stewardship, or we only wanted road safety, for instance, we could impose controls to achieve those goals, but they would make other forms of life impossible. And I think the same is true about viewpoint diversity, because ultimately, and I'll wrap up here, what we want from viewpoint diversity is to create an environment that fosters truth-seeking and the possibility of reaching the truth. But when you create viewpoint diversity for its own sake, there is also a chance that in doing so, you are not fostering the search for truth, you're in fact obscuring it and inhibiting it. And my argument, and what I still wrestle with, is that by sharing a stage with this person, I'm doing more to obscure the truth than I am to promoting it.
Thank you. And again, thank you for your honesty and, dare I say, vulnerability in the way your article was written, your open struggle. Adam, you wrote a beautiful piece and poetic and an exploration of the indigenous Jewish sources, Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan, describing how disagreement is part and parcel of the Jewish tradition. But then you also open up this new category of Ahavat Israel, love for Israel, as sort of a threshold test, that it's okay to disagree insofar as you are doing it not just for the sake of heaven, but for the sake of the global people of Israel. So I was wondering if you could share your own journey of how you arrived at that.
Sure. Well, I did the Daf Yomi cycle of Talmud study from 2012 to 2020, and I wrote about it in Tablet. I wrote a sort of weekly column. And I had not done any Talmud study. I wasn't part of my Jewish education, so I was really sort of learning for myself, what is this tradition? What does it have to say? And one of the things that I had always heard about Talmudic debate is that it values diversity of opinion, right? That in the Talmud, it's not just telling you what the law is. It says, this rabbi says X, and that rabbi says Y, and usually one of them is sort of the majority opinion or the governing opinion, but the dissenter is also recorded. And the sort of famous formulation of this ethos is, there's a discussion about the debates between Hillel and Shammai, the great rabbis, who often had different interpretations on lots of points of law. And once that there's a story in the Talmud that once they argued over something for 3 years, and finally a voice from heaven came and said, both of these are the words of the living God, but the law is in accordance with the opinion of Hillel. In other words, Hillel's views govern, but both of them are sacred, both of them are equally valid, both of them deserve to be honored, right? But there are also limits to that disagreement. And so while the rabbis of the Talmud disagree about a lot of things, there are many sort of the crucial things, the basic things they don't disagree on. And a good example of that, which I talk about a bit in the essay, is the heretical figure known as Acher, the other, who is a rabbi like these other rabbis who ended up sort of straying into heresy and falling away from Jewish law and committing various kinds of sins, and then eventually he ends up in Gehenna, in hell. And so there's a sort of difference between a disagreement where both sides are speaking for the sake of heaven. There's a formula, machlochet l'shem shamayim, a disagreement for the cause of heaven, for the name of heaven, for the sake of heaven, and those that aren't. And a disagreement that's not for the sake of heaven is not honored and does not endure, and you're not supposed to respect both sides. So the real question is, how do you know? How do you know which is which? And in fact, it's very complicated. It's very hard to know, even in that example of Acher, it says in the Talmud that when he died, the heavenly court didn't know whether to send him to heaven or hell because he knew so much Torah that he shouldn't go to hell, but he had these radical opinions, so he shouldn't go to heaven. And he was sort of in limbo for a while until finally one of his students, who had then died and went to heaven, and said, I think you should send him to hell. And he ended up going to hell. And the proof of this was that smoke rose from his grave on earth. So it's a very interesting story about how difficult it is to know where you draw the line, how far you have to go before you're not supposed to talk to someone, where it's no longer a disagreement for the sake of heaven. What united all of those sort of legitimate disagreements was the idea that they were interpreting God's law. They were interpreting what God wanted and interpreting Torah through different traditions that they had learned and through different techniques that they used to analyze it. But there was no disagreement about the basic principle of this is halakha, this is God's will, and we're trying to ascertain it and carry it out. In the modern Jewish world, that is no longer a sort of sine qua non for a Jewish disagreement. I think that in the modern Jewish world, we don't usually frame our disagreements in terms of what would God want, what does God want from us. There are different ways to answer that question. Different denominations and congregations and individuals have different ways of answering that question. But there's a much broader spectrum of opinion on all kinds of religious and ritual and halachic practices than there was in ancient times. And so if you say you can't do what, for example, the Jews of Amsterdam famously did to Spinoza, where he wouldn't recant his opinions, and so they excommunicated him, and then he left the community and no one would talk to him, and no one was allowed to go near him or visit his home or marry him. You can't do that anymore, because it's certainly not an American Jewry. It's too diverse, there are too many different people. If you can't fit into one congregation, you can fit into some other congregation. There's no effective ostracism, there's no effective cutting people off, unless you come from a community that's very tight-knit, and where you cut someone off, that really does mean they lose all of their relationships, as in some ultra-Orthodox communities. So in that condition, when you're talking about, well, what does it mean to say, you've gone too far, I won't talk to you, I disagree with you, in practical terms, it might not mean as much. It doesn't necessarily mean as much. It's really, I think, more a question of when we're having conversations among Jews in the Jewish community, what are the sort of principles that should guide our conversation? What is the thing that we should all be thinking about and trying to have in common? And what I say in the article is that it's really no longer L'Shem Shamayim, for the sake of heaven, but it's L'Shem Am Yisrael, for the sake of the Jewish people. That is what makes a Jewish argument, is that it wants the best for the Jewish people. And I think that is a formulation that embraces a lot of different viewpoints. It can embrace both Zionism and anti-Zionism, because I'm talking about Peter Beinart, who I assume is what we were talking about. He is someone who would definitely say that his opposition to a Jewish state is in the name of Jewish values, and he thinks that the Jewish people would be better served by not having a Jewish state. He's very critical of the way that politics and statehood has affected the way Jews think about Judaism. So from his point of view, he is making an argument for the sake of the Jewish people. He's just reaching a conclusion that I think is wrong, but it's an argument that I think can be argued with and should be argued with. And the difference, maybe the place where it's no longer a Jewish argument, is if a person who is Jewish but is not arguing for the sake of the Jewish people, is not saying the well-being of the Jewish people is my primary, not only, but a primary value for me. And I think there are a lot of people, and we've seen this a lot since October 7th, where their sole public Jewish identification is to criticize Israel. That there's not a lot of there's no positive content to their Jewish identity except to disassociate themselves from Zionism. And that, I think, is an example of someone who is not arguing for the sake of the Jewish people, and maybe that argument does not need to be engaged with.
Right. It seems like a very tough thing to identify, right? I mean, anti-Zionism might be one thing, but simply dissent with the Israeli government. I mean, hundreds of thousands of Israelis are expressing dissent with the Israeli government as an expression of love of country. You yourself are noting that there are some anti-Zionists in the world who believe that to be an expression of their love of the Jewish people. So is it just kind of, I mean, I guess the question is to both of you gentlemen, is it just kind of a you know it when you see it? Or Bret, your line seems to be a little different, that post-October 7th, anti-Zionism itself is off the table, whereas Adam, you're sort of saying if it's coming from a place of love of the Jewish people, then it's okay.
So I've thought about this, and one of the things that this person who I'm trying to maintain is...
You know, the irony, he's not here on the Bema, but he's very much here on the Bema.
Is that he frequently says, well, you know, before the declaration of the state, there were many illustrious Jews who were anti-Zionists, right? There were powerful arguments that were made before 1948 that a Jewish state would be a net negative for the Jewish people, that it couldn't survive, that it would just gather Jews into a place where they were likely to be decimated once again or wiped out once again. All of these are plausible arguments to be had while Zionism remains a theoretical construct. Zionism is not a theoretical construct. It's a state that has right now about 10 million people in it. And when we talk about anti-Zionism, we can't simply speak about it as a purely theoretical, we're not talking about ideas that are yet to be born out. You know, how we should, say, regulate AI, for example, or something in the future. We're talking about a real place, a real state with actual human beings, millions of whom are proudly Zionist, millions of whom do not want to be dispossessed, millions of whom want to stay where they are, in fact, overwhelmingly want to stay where they are with their state. And whenever I hear not just, okay, Peter, but others make the case that Zionism is bad for the Jews, I have yet to see an example or see them lay out exactly what happens, right? Okay, we're gonna get rid of the Jewish state. We're gonna have one state for all the people. And then what exactly happens to the Jews? Well, you know, there are models of coexistence, you know, all this stuff. And I say to them, what's the model? Is it in the best possible circumstances, what's happened to the Copts in Egypt or to the Maimonides of Lebanon, most of whom have been forced to leave? Or is the model something much darker, which is what Hamas gave us a taste of on October 7th? So at some point in this argument, the actual likely probability that the Jews of the state of Israel would be wholly dispossessed or enslaved or massacred or otherwise mistreated, that has to be part of an actual argument, right? And you can't just say, well, wouldn't it be nice if they just Rodney King-like all got along? Because you know very well that that's not going to happen. So what are you in fact arguing for beyond the sort of theoretical, wouldn't it be nice? What you're actually arguing for is the destruction, uniquely, the destruction of a state, which we haven't seen, although Putin is attempting it with Ukraine, and the eradication or terrible misery for more than half the world's Jews. And I can't for the life of me see how that is an argument for the Jewish people. Right. Much less for the sake of heaven.
Adam, you good, or you want to get in on that?
I think that you just summarized why you should debate him, because that is a very powerful argument. And I think that, I agree with you, and I think that that is the winning argument in that situation. But if you say to someone, I'm not going to discuss it with you, I think what people take away from that is, I'm afraid to discuss it with you. I don't have a good argument. I think that, I mean, it depends also obviously on, we're talking about different settings, right? What's appropriate in a Hebrew school or a Jewish summer camp is not necessarily appropriate, the same standard as on the stage of an event like this or at a secular institution where you have a different kind of audience. But that is exactly what an argument, that is a good empirical, realistic Zionist argument. And I think that where a lot of these things go wrong, where a lot of these conversations go wrong, is that, especially when it's among parents and children or grandparents and grandchildren, Or you see people like student demonstrators who say that they're associated with Jewish Voice for Peace or places like that, that there's such an anger and sense of betrayal and a need to discipline those voices that to them what it looks like is you don't have anything to say, you don't have an argument, you're trying to tell us what we can't say, right? And I think that, to go back to Spinoza, one thing Spinoza said about religious tolerance, and this at a time when people didn't really have religious tolerance the way we do now, is that you can't force someone to believe something, you can only force them to say they believe it. The only way that you can get someone to actually believe something is to explain to them why they should believe it. And so I think that was a great explanation. There was a great explanation, I would make the exact same argument against some of what Peter Beinart wrote. He famously wrote an essay, or famously, but he wrote an essay 15 years ago called Yavne, which said that Israel needs to disappear because Judaism is ready to transition into a new historical phase, similarly to the way that it transitioned away from being a temple-based religion after the destruction of the temple. A small number of scholars went to this town of Yavne and opened an academy to study Torah, and that became sort of the beginning of rabbinic Judaism, which is what we think of as Judaism today. And he said that's what we need to do today. What he didn't say was that the reason why we had Yavne is because about 1.5 million Jews in ancient Judah were killed in a war. So that, I think, is a great realistic argument. It's saying, look at the consequences of what you're arguing, carry it out to its next conclusion, to its ultimate conclusion, and I think that is very much an argument that's worth having and worth winning.
You know, can I just make one point? About 15 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, I reviewed The Crisis of Zionism, his book at the time, and I found myself going to his footnotes. And the footnotes never quite said, again and again, what he claimed they said in the book itself. And it's very difficult to have an argument with a person who continually misuses his citations to make his case. And I went, there's the review I wrote for Tablet magazine at the time, lengthy review, but I went back and back to the footnotes, and time and again, there was a misuse of a citation. And it is very problematic to have an argument with a person who is so repeatedly willing to misuse sources to make arguments that seem superficially convincing and requires very minute examination to show that they're in fact not convincing. There was a kind of a quality, I felt like I was arguing against grease, you know, and I don't mean the country, I mean like the oily substance, right? I always felt oily throughout the entire process of reviewing that book. So I take your point, and again, if you read my essay, I'm not sure that I'm right in not arguing with him. But it is really problematic when you find yourself faced with someone who so repeatedly misuses his sources that you're not actually dealing with something solid.
Okay. Ariella, I want to turn to you. There's something that makes me uncomfortable about this conversation, because I think of Jewish spaces. And I'm the father of 3 college students and one who just graduated college. And I think of like a Hillel on a campus, right? They make a place for the Orthodox minyan, the Reform minyan, the conservative, the atheist club, whatever club you want. You know, it's a job, right? A JCC has for this stream of Jewish life, that stream of Jewish life, the OJC, the organized Jewish community, come as you are, we're going to make space for you. But you're sort of sit in a position where you see the comings and goings of Jewish philanthropy and what goes on in institutional life. And I'm deeply worried that if our children who are of whose view on Israel, and I've written about this and I've preached on this, who find themselves at odds with the choices of the Israeli government and how the war is prosecuted in Gaza, and find because the philanthropic back of these institutions is funded by a different generation, not the kids' generation, then they're not just going to walk away from Israel, but they're going to walk away from Jewish life, period, right? Why would they walk in if there's only a certain framework by which to express your relationship with Israel? So how are you seeing this play out in the OJC, the organized Jewish community?
So I'll zoom out for a minute and then try to address that question a little bit more specifically. Obviously, the Jewish community doesn't exist in a vacuum. We all live and work in a wider world. We interact with people outside of, most of us interact with people outside of the organized Jewish community. We read things besides SAPIR. And so a lot of what we're seeing, I think, within the organized Jewish community is reflective of the larger cultural, societal issues that we're seeing in America around polarization and sort of people's inability to really understand and have any empathy for people who disagree with them. And I think we've seen some surveys about this. Just in America, 2/3 of Americans feel uncomfortable sometimes voicing a political perspective. In surveys in the American Jewish community, half of employees feel uncomfortable voicing what they see as an unpopular opinion at work. And by the way, I bet most of the time it's not necessarily an unpopular opinion, but a number of their other colleagues feel uncomfortable voicing the same opinion, and so it never gets heard. And that self-censorship is sort of self-perpetuating. I mean, we see this most of all on college campuses, actually. There's obviously much conversation about Israel, but it's driven by the extremes, and people who, including many Jewish students, who feel somewhere in the middle or may not have very well-formed opinions, just opt out of those conversations. There was a survey done in November, December of 2023, so shortly after October 7th, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the most toxic issue on campus in terms of what students are afraid to talk about. So more than race, gender, politics, whatever it is, half of college students will not even talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think that includes a lot of Jewish college students who went to college in search of truth and to look for a good education and didn't go there to get pulled in to be an activist or to take firm positions on everything or feel like they have to be expert on everything. But to your question about Jewish organizations, particularly how they are dealing with those sort of on the margins of Jewish life, and particularly when it comes to Israel, I think a lot of organizations are struggling with this and have been struggling with it for a long time. I remember one of the first conversations that I had with somebody who worked for a progressive Jewish organization. This is probably 5-6 years ago. There was a conflagration between Israel and the Palestinians, and this leader wanted to put out a statement of support for Israel at that time when Israel was being attacked. And his colleagues at the organization could not agree on what that statement should say. And so they ended up not putting out a statement at all, even though they had put out statements on many other sort of more political topics of the day that their staff all sort of had a very singular perspective on. And a lot of the organizations that we support, and we support a very broad swath of organizations in the Jewish community, they're trying to appeal to a broad spectrum, often, of Jews. They're not necessarily just going for Reform Jews or Orthodox Jews or liberal or conservative, but it's become increasingly hard for them to deliver programs that bring together people who have different perspectives, even on issues that are completely irrelevant to what they might be coming together about. And some organizations in those spaces, I think, again, particularly on the left, sort of avoided the Israel conversation because it felt too complicated. And when October 7th happened, that became very problematic for them. I think their leadership saw themselves, for example, as Zionist organizations, but they didn't talk about it, and there was a lot of confusion then among participants and even staff members of those organizations about exactly where we stand, what are our values when it comes to Israel, how do we respond publicly or even privately, internally, to what's going on, and what is our role here. And October 7th really crystallized that for leadership, and I think in a positive way is forcing Jewish organizations to articulate what their own values are and how those values then inform the boundaries of those conversations. So, and maybe this is true for some of us as individuals too. I think Bret articulated the boundaries of what he feels are fruitful, effective, truth-seeking conversations. And for some, the boundaries are going to be narrower than others, and I hope that there are places, and I know that there are places that will engage with Jews who have perhaps more extreme views on Israel, and there are others that rightfully are saying these conversations are beyond the boundaries of what the values that we reflect as an organization, and it's a distraction for us to engage with them.
All right.
I'm reminded of a joke, if I may, since Hanan told one. This was a little racier than Hanan's. A young couple that's very young, very recently married, go to their rabbi to get the rules of the road for their conjugal life. And the rabbi says, ask me anything. And so they're asking about one thing after another. And he's like, it's a mitzvah, it's a mitzvah. And then finally they say, well, how about, can we do it standing? He says, no. Could lead to dancing. I tried to tell that in a tame way.
I know who told you that joke also, but keep going.
Okay. So there are limits, and I think, one of my claims to fame is I think I coined the term October 8th Jews. And I think for the October 8th Jew, just picking up on what Ariella said, to have vigorous debates about what future Israel ought to have is a mitzvah. It's great. There should be a huge variety of viewpoints, some very far to the left of mine. But to have a debate over whether Israel should even have a future, that's different.
Right. But there is a chilling effect taking place right now, right? So, we're all operating from a post-trauma, or actually, as you correctly note, existential threats. This isn't an imagined threat. This is an actual threat. Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, the hostages still in captivity. This is very real, very real. But when you are experiencing the trauma in which we are in, right, from a pastoral point of view, if someone grabs something from you, you grab it back twice as hard. And so it is this moment in time where we can say, well, look, it's about time that keffiyehs were banned on campuses, right? Where, I think that's a rather reasonable thing to say if Jewish safety and security is a value of yours. But there are also other values, like due process, like civil liberties, like research for cancer care, like other things that we might value as reasonable people. But if you give voice to that, right, you're seeing whether this is happening. I mean, there's an online element to it, but there's a question of whether or not the Jewish community is able to house a diversity of views when we are in this moment of trauma. When we are in this moment of trauma, because right now the stakes are high, shields are up, and we need all the friends that we can get, and to express complexity, to express dissent with the Netanyahu government, with the Trump administration, is seen as a betrayal of the cause. And I think that's very scary, the chilling effect that's taking place right now.
Look, in the time since October 7th, I've written columns saying Netanyahu has to step down. I actually think this is a time where we can have really rich conversations, actually richer than perhaps we'd had before, because the stakes are higher, because we really have to think through the balance between our commitment to civil liberties and liberal values, both in Israel and the United States. Just today, if you read the conversation in the New York Times, I end with a plea that we should not be throwing people out of the country, even non-citizens, because we don't like their op-eds, because we don't like their speech. And then also considerations of Jewish safety and existential considerations. This should not be a moment. I don't actually detect the chilling effect that you're describing. If anything,
maybe it's just normal for you.
But these conversations everywhere are really vivid, and they are really valid. Okay, and nothing I'm saying should detract from the fact that there are vibrant topics that are dividing the people in Rabin Square from other places in Israel. This is viewpoint diversity at its best, right? Because it is for the sake of heaven, because it is for the sake of the people of Israel. But there are, in fact, a number of views out there up in Morningside Heights and in the pages in certain op-eds, whose only conclusion, right, is the destruction of a state, and the part that's not said is the destruction or dispossession of millions of people who happen to be Jews. Right. And I'm not calling us to censor it, right, necessarily, but I'm saying we should at least recognize what that is. Just as I wouldn't call it to censor an anti-Semite on the street. There's a First Amendment in this country which I respect, but I will call it out for what it is.
Right. Adam, is it what is being said, or is it who is saying it that's at issue here? Meaning, I remember Rabbi Sachs of blessed memory. He would have these public debates with atheists and all sorts of folk, but he would never sit down with a reform or conservative rabbi on the same stage, right? Because to hear it from your own was considered particularly obnoxious, right? They were debating not Israel, but just to share the stage, as it were. And I'm wondering, right, are all non-Zionisms equal, right? That you'll engage in debate with a college professor who's not Jewish or pro-Palestinian, but not another person, or that it's coming from your own children or your grandchildren, or is a non-Zionist who lives on the Upper West Side different than a non-Zionist who lives in Borough Park, right? Or I was wondering if you could peel that onion a little.
I mean, I think maybe even more than that, it has to do with our sense of who's listening to these conversations. I remember that Hillel Halkin, who's the great translator, Hebrew translator, once wrote something to the effect of, "It's too bad that Jews don't have a language that we could speak to each other when we don't want other people to listen in, to hear what we're talking about." And of course he was being sarcastic because Hebrew is such a language, but in America we don't speak it. But I think that one reason why a lot of this feels so fraught and dangerous is that it's one thing to have a debate among Jews about what's best for Jews, but when you think that the effect of it is to sway larger public opinion and thus political forces that could eventually have a real concrete effect on the fate of the state, right? If the United States foreign policy turns against Israel and an administration is elected that decides to stop selling weapons to Israel, for example, that could be a very serious problem. And so I think that there's a tendency to say, we can't say this, we can't have this conversation openly, or we can't have it because it's too dangerous. The possible consequences are too dangerous. And that's one of the differences between the search for truth and politics, which is about building coalitions and getting things done. And those two things don't go along very well. I think that maybe there's a place for both. Both are necessary in different settings among different kinds of people. But I do think that maybe the sort of first move in all of this is to never be afraid of telling the truth about what is happening and has happened. I think that when we're afraid to tell the truth about history or the present, it puts people in a defensive crouch, and it makes them very easy to anger and upset, and eventually very easy to defeat. because then eventually a truth that you are afraid to acknowledge will be exposed, and it'll show that you are not telling the whole truth, that you're afraid of the truth. And so I do think that with a lot of discussion about Israel in particular, and this gets into what I wrote about in my book about settler colonialism, there's a lot of, I think that Jews and Zionists are often very defensive about the history of Israel, and there are things about it that we don't want to discuss or mention or allow to be discussed that are not at all taboo in Israel, right? Because in Israel, everyone knows this history. They know what has actually happened in the history of the state. But if you were to say, that there was a Nakba in 1948 and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were driven from their homes, a lot of people would get very defensive and angry. Jews would get very defensive and angry about that and not want to discuss it, not want to bring it into the conversation. And so therefore, if you're a young person and you've been raised in a Zionist home, synagogue going home, you've always been taught that Israel is good and Israel is important, and then you go to college or somewhere and you say, what about this Nakba? I never heard about this. No one ever told me about this. Or what are the actual conditions for Palestinians in the West Bank? When Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example, goes to the West Bank and sees the segregation and the military rule and comes back and says, look at all this stuff. And if you're a young Jew who did not know about this and had thought, Israel is always good and always in the right, that creates this huge cognitive dissonance and I think anger and confusion. So the first, I think, the first key to any kind of discussion is to acknowledge the truth, to not put yourself in opposition to the truth. The reason why I don't think that that's a dangerous thing to do for Jews in Israel is that what we need to cultivate is not the idea that Israel is never wrong or never guilty or that no Israeli has ever committed a war crime or any of that stuff, which is obviously not true. It's the idea that we are members of a people that have interests that we can't ignore and escape, that you can't dissociate yourself from the Jewish people. I think that a lot of what people want to dissociate themselves from when they become anti-Zionist, when they criticize Israel, is they don't want to be held responsible for things that they had nothing to do with, right? They don't want to be told, which happens a lot among young people, and it happens on social media because this is the way social media debates often happen, is that one 20-year-old will say to another 20-year-old, you're Jewish and you're a Zionist and therefore you're responsible for genocide in Gaza. Realistically, neither person in that conversation has any effect over what's going to happen in the Middle East at all. And you could even say that none of us here do either, or very little. When we were talking about these things, a lot of what we're talking about is, what kind of person am I? What do I believe? How does it reflect on me to say that I believe in one thing versus another? Those are all sort of separate from the real issue. The real issue, or the sort of ultimate political reality, is that the Jewish people is a people, that what happens to one part of it affects all of us, and that I think is the most important thing to teach and inculcate, rather than to sort of say, you can't criticize Israel, you can't criticize Zionism, to say, what is best for the Jewish people, what is best for me is what is best for the Jewish people, and vice versa. I think even within the Jewish community, a lot of people don't like to say that because there are such strong disagreements. But if you start from that starting point, maybe the other kinds of disagreements become easier to have.
It's funny that young Jews are scandalized that they are not the product of a virginal birth.
Yeah.
I had this experience. I was in Australia last summer and talking about the Middle East. And at some point, after a talk I'd given in Sydney, a young college student stood up and said, well, Mr. Stephens, will you talk about the Israel's legacy as a settler colonial state? And I looked around and noticed nobody of obvious Aboriginal features. And I said, is anyone here Aboriginal? Of course, it was a complete silence. I said, well, what do you think you guys are here in Australia? What are you white people doing here on the other end of the earth speaking the English language? And what are we in the United States, other than Native Americans, doing there? What kind of state are we? In fact, investigate a little closely into the origins of nearly any state, And you will find, I mean, and Adam, of course, knows this material even better than I do, or far better than I do, this horrifying fact that there is settler colonialism at work. The same Jews who suddenly alight on the, on the Nakba, as Palestinians call it, would be stunned to learn that this Turkish city called Izmir was once a thriving Greek city until the early 1920s, when all the Greeks were kicked out of a city we used to know as Smyrna. If you look at a map of Germany, you would find that large parts of Poland were once German cities. This kind of dispossession, in fact, was exactly what was happening all over the world on a massive scale after the end of the Second World War, including millions of Pakistanis who trace their origins to places now in India, and millions of Hindus who trace their origins to places now in Pakistan. And so I absolutely agree with Adam. We should tell the truth. People talk about Deir Yassin, right? Well, a lot of bad things happened in Israel's War of Independence, and no one is saying that the Jewish armies behaved spotlessly. But let me introduce you to war crimes committed in massive ways by American GIs in the Philippines, in Okinawa, in France. In fact, on D-Day, which we commemorate as one of the most heroic assaults in American history, American bombers, by some estimates, killed as many as 25,000 French civilians on the 6th of June of 1944, in one day of bombing. So Adam is right. We should air all the dirty laundry, but what we should remind our friends is that there's a lot of dirty laundry to be aired, only a small fraction of which happens to be Jewish.
I'm going to ask, I have about 8,000 more questions. I'm going to ask one more question, maybe, and then I'm going to open it up for a few questions here. So this is your warning that you have time to think about your brief statement that ends with a question mark. What about the other side? Meaning, I have the luxury. I make no claim for viewpoint diversity in this institution, other than my views that change over the course of a day. But I've said, this Bima, if we have speakers here, if you're interested in a secure Jewish democratic state, you're allowed to speak here. And there are a million different expressions, but if you're not interested in a Jewish state, you have no place to speak in this synagogue. And if you're not interested in a democratic state of Israel, you don't have a place to speak. So I wouldn't invite someone who's looking to transfer Palestinians out of their homeland. I wouldn't invite someone whose views were anathema to what I read as the founding documents of the state of Israel. So to all three of you, and Ariella, you touched a little on this. We were at a conference earlier in the week on this, but what about those, right? An election denier, someone who's just sort of off the map, or your map in the other direction, saying they don't have a place in the conversation. They're good on Israel, but not on my Bima or editorial page or journal.
Yeah, I think much of this conversation and much of the conversation in the Jewish community around this question is often relatively binary. This is our tent, maybe it's in Israel, maybe it's in America, and these perspectives are out and these perspectives are in and worth engaging with. And I think it's important to remember that there are a lot of gradations in between. And I spent a lot of time last year with a group of senior professionals in the Jewish community talking about how we navigate this. And one of the tools that we developed that I found to be very helpful in speaking to folks in the Jewish community is giving people sort of options of how to engage with difficult perspectives. So platforming, promoting a particular perspective like you do here is one, obviously. And you probably want to draw fairly strict lines around what, as you just articulated, what you might want, what views you want to promote that reflect your organization and your ideals. But just because you're not promoting or platforming or perspective doesn't mean that you can't engage with it. So you can also, you could feature it in a broader conversation, in a panel discussion, in a workshop. You could include a perspective that you're uncomfortable with in a staff meeting and engage with it through reading an article, bringing somebody in to talk about it. The difficult conversations are around when you're going to exclude or remove a perspective perhaps that is already in your tent. I think that's something that came up after October 7th inside of some Jewish organizations. It surfaced some perspectives that people may not have realized were already inside of their organization that felt very misaligned with how the rest of the organization identified. And that's a very real and difficult question of what do you do when you're faced with that, when it's already inside the tent? But these two sort of binaries of promoting a particular perspective to engage with it or excluding it are only part of the picture. And I think it's important also to remember that it's not just for the Jewish community. The Israel conversation, the Zionism conversation is a very challenging and a very important one to have. But a lot of the ways in which Jewish organizations are grappling with this go beyond Israel. How do you engage with, if you're on one side of the political spectrum, Jews who campaigned for Trump? What do you think about Jews who think that Judea and Samaria only belong to the Jews? What do you do with Jews who engage with organizations that maybe after October 7th took a very publicly critical position about Israel or about another Jewish issue? These are, I think, the gray sort of areas that are very real and that Jewish organizations are figuring out how to grapple with.
Thank you. The red lines on the other side?
Well, it makes me think of what happened at the 92nd Street Y in the fall of 2023, because that, I thought, was it was a clarifying moment where the 92nd Street Y, which is sort of is and isn't a Jewish organization, has a very distinguished reading series, literary reading series, where lots of famous writers come to give readings, and they'd invited a famous writer named Viet Thanh Nguyen, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, and who was one of the people who, right after October 7th, came out in a very pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel way. And he was scheduled to do a reading at the Y, like later in October, and the institution canceled it. And it got a lot of bad press. The director of that reading series quit. A lot of writers said, I'm not going to ever come to the Y again. But it was a moment when the organization had to decide, is this a Jewish organization or not? And I think that in the end they made the right choice. I think that the choice that they made was to say, again, if we're talking about this question of disagreements for the sake of the Jewish people, that if you are going to be here, you can have various views as long as they are Jewish, as long as it is part of a Jewish argument. If it's against Judaism, if it's against the Jewish people, then it should be happening somewhere else, not at the 92nd Street Y.
I didn't like that decision.
We have disagreement
There you go.
in the last 2 minutes.
Because if it happens to be that incidentally you have a view that is obnoxious to the institution that is hosting you, but you have already been invited and you are there not to speak of your obnoxious view, but about a book you've just published or something else, then my view was that the Y should have hosted him, understanding full well that I think Adam's point is well taken and strong, because this brings us down a slippery slope where you would then, for every speaker you invite, Elliot, have to kind of do a deep digging on everything that he has said, she has said, over the course of a long career. And inevitably, because we live in a world where everything we've ever said is sticky and ineradicable, you find that person X said something objectionable 2-3 years ago. That person is not on this bima to talk about that thing, and yet there it is, he has this bad thought. And I think that veers into a real kind of illiberalism. It's something I have a little bit of experience with when when I joined the Times, algorithms searched for every objectionable sentence I'd written. I'd probably written, I don't know, 1 million published words at the time. And over a course of 1 million words, I probably said a bunch of stupid things or things I don't regret, I no longer thought, or also things that were just ripped out of context to be made to seem much worse than they in fact were. And that really takes you into a kind of a direction that I don't think a liberal-minded institution wants to be.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's open it up for a couple questions from the community.
There's a couple of gentlemen here in the front.
Yeah, but you've just overstepped your bounds there, Bret. I call on people, not you. Yes, please.
I have a question. So in the 1980s, I was the president of the Cornell College Republicans, and we spent a lot of time on campus in the 1980s arguing about anti-communism. So we talked about the Sandinistas and the Contras and the captive nations of Latvia, Lithuania, and another one of the Baltic states. Pretty much nobody knew anything about the Contras or the Sandinistas or what was going on behind the Iron Curtain. But there was a lot of argument and there was a lot of passion, sort of kind of like what's going on in Colombia today. But
let's get a question.
The question is, this feels next level, and I'm wondering, if you compare what happened with those kinds of debates, is this more, it feels to me, and I'm curious what the panel thinks, this feels Jew hatred is more what's going on here than anything. So I'd like to open the floor.
Can I take that?
Well, I think this gets into a really interesting question, especially now that we're seeing the federal government intervene in universities in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, which is, do we as a people want to be the people who need the federal government to come and keep us safe at a campus like Columbia? To me, that's not a good position for individual Jewish students at that campus, and it's not a good position for the Jewish people politically, because it puts us in the same position that historically Jews had been in pre-democratic, pre-liberal societies, where instead of being participants in the society, we were wards of the state, wards of the prince, right? That instead of having horizontal alliances, we had vertical alliances. The king will protect the Jews. Everyone hates the Jews and would like to drive them out, but the king will protect them. And I feel like there's an element of that in what's going on now with the idea that Jews can't handle having Palestinian protesters on campus, and so therefore they need the federal government to come in and protect them. It's funny how these things change, the valences of them change so rapidly depending on what side you're on or how the debate shifts. A few years ago, the idea that there was something called safetyism, the idea that if you're a college student, that you should always have the right to feel safe, was being identified by a lot of conservatives as a problem on campuses, that being a student or being a thinking person is not about feeling safe, it's about taking risks and meeting challenges. Now I feel like maybe people who would have said that about 5 years ago are now saying, well, we need to be kept safe from Palestinian advocacy. We shouldn't be subjected to it. I think obviously there are points at which it goes beyond advocacy and into, like vandalism or destruction of property at Columbia, which we saw over the last year. But my sort of personal preference, and I would say this without having been to Columbia, right? So I wasn't there, so I don't know. But I would rather have the Jewish people feel strong and confident enough to not be afraid of other people's contrary views, rather than saying we need the government to come in and protect us from those views.
I mean, I would just say I agree with Adam, except that the problem at Columbia is not the speech, it's the conduct. And there is an important distinction when Jewish students don't merely feel emotionally unsafe, but actually physically unsafe. Yeah. There's a real difference.
Right. I think we have time for one more here. Yeah.
What does the panel think of the future of J Street and Jews for Justice in Palestine and all those outfits after October 7th?
Seems like an Ariella question.
Look, I'll give you a chance to think. I'll dive into the fire here. Some of my best friends are left-leaning liberal Jews, okay? So let me just make clear, I think with the caveat that was the distinction that was made earlier, that there are left-leaning progressive Jews who are not aligned with the decisions of the Israeli government, who believe that their protest of the Israeli government is in the best interests of the future of the Jewish state. Those are not other, those are our own people, our own children and grandchildren, and they are critically important for the Jewish conversation and should not be labeled as treasonous in their expression of the self-same thing that is expressed on any street in Israel any night of the week. And so I just need to be very clear. And the thing that we need to realize is that your J Streets, your Truas, your left-leaning organizations are actually getting a lot of heat from the, I don't even know all the acronyms of all the, but the non-Zionist, anti-Zionist organizations, that if we pick off the progressive Zionist community in our midst, we will have only ourselves to blame if we find them marginalized, disaffiliating from the Zionist conversation as a whole. And so at great danger do we do that. That's very different than the anti-Zionists that I think are seeking the destruction of the sovereign state of Israel. But the J Streets of the world, critically important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We need a strong, progressive Zionist left. And I say this as someone who would argue, you know, until the cows came home on various points of policy. But they are honored members of our collective conversation. There's always been a powerful Jewish left and important dissents from the direction of Israel on any number of fronts, because they are, as they see themselves, sometimes convincingly, arguing for that essential combination of Jewish and democratic. And I think that's a terrific conversation to have, and another very good illustration of the way in which we can have rich and very vigorous differences within our community and still say, and yet there is something that is outside the tent. There are forms of argument that don't seek to enliven and offer different possibilities for Israel, but really just want this country to end, knowing full well what the consequences are likely to be.
Yeah, I would echo that. I don't think anybody here disagrees that there should be a strong progressive left. I think what I suspect the question was getting at was more about strongly anti-Zionist Jews who are not advocating for a particularly progressive vision of Israel, but might be advocating for something more akin to the views that Bret described earlier that he no longer wants to engage with. And I don't have a satisfactory answer for what the solution to that is. I think Rabbi Cosgrove proposed a bit of one. I think we, as a Jewish community, and I hate to even say that because we are many Jewish communities, but if we are going to draw lines in which those people are outside most of our tents, we also need to think about what then happens to those people. What is the plan for them?
Right. Friends, I made a comment at the beginning of the panel off the cuff that you had the 4 children sitting here, but it's actually apropos because we are just days away from our Passover Seders. It is the model of Jewish dialogue. The 4 children are given questions. Truth is not top down. If you do a close read of the Haggadah, truth is bottom up of how we respond to the questions that are posed to us. And I think that the magic of the Passover Seder, or the conundrum of the Passover Seder, is no different than our own. because not every question is dignified. The second child is wrapped on the teeth because they read themselves out of the Jewish narrative. There are boundaries, and yet, at the end of the Seder, or at least at that point of the Seder, they're all sitting at the table. And for me, the challenge of this moment is exactly to the issue of SAPIR, which is how do we keep everyone at the table and say there are certain conversations that count you in as part of the Jewish narrative and some where you are counted out. I couldn't be prouder to have this conversation here on the Bima. I couldn't be prouder of the partnership between Park Avenue Synagogue and SAPIR, one of many, many evenings spent together. Thank you everyone so much for being here.
Good stuff.